One switch. That is what stands between you and the story ending differently. One low-voltage switch on a hydrogen bomb falling toward the farmland of North Carolina. At 12:35 in the morning on January 24th, 1961. The switch held, but 3 others on the same weapon had already failed. The arming sequence had begun. The firing signal had been sent, and the people sleeping in Goldsboro, North Carolina, had no idea any of this was happening above their heads. They were never told. Not that night. Not for decades. The document that confirmed how close it had been stayed classified until 2013. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina, January 23, 1961. A B-52 Stratofortress designated Keep 19 rolls down the runway just after midnight. The crew is 8 men. The aircraft is carrying 2 Mach 39 hydrogen bombs. Each one yields 3.8 megatons. Each one is 260 times more powerful than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima. The mission is a routine airborne alert patrol off the Atlantic coast. This is what Strategic Air Command does. Keeps bombers in the air at all times, loaded, ready. Therefore, the most powerful weapons ever built by the United States are routinely circling the eastern seaboard, above the homes and farms and towns of ordinary Americans who do not know they are there. Keep 19 takes off. Everything is normal. But 3 hours into the flight, over South Carolina, a tanker crew notices something wrong. The right wing of the B-52 is leaking fuel. The leak is severe. More than 5,400 gallons lost in under 3 minutes. Therefore, the crew turns back towards Seymour Johnson. They hold offshore near Wilmington, burning off fuel, waiting for advice from Boeing. Then they begin their descent. But the unbalanced fuel load has made the aircraft nearly impossible to control. The right wing is shearing away. At 12:35 in the morning, the aircraft breaks apart over Wayne County. The crew ejects. 5 survive. 2 do not. And as the fuselage spins toward the earth, centrifugal force pulls a lanyard in the cockpit. The lanyard is the same mechanism a crew member would pull to release the bombs over an enemy target. Therefore, the bombs are released. The first bomb falls with its parachute deploying correctly. It descends slowly, drifts, and comes to rest hanging in a tree. It is recovered almost intact, but the first bomb had gone through almost every step of its arming sequence. The safing pins had been pulled. The arming rods had been extracted. The thermal batteries had fired. The timer had completed its cycle. The trajectory arming switch had closed all its contacts. One switch. The low voltage arm and safe switch. It was in the safe position. Therefore, the first bomb did not detonate. The second bomb does not have a parachute. It hits the farmland of Faro, North Carolina, at over 700 miles per hour. It buries itself 180 feet into the mud. When investigators begin to excavate, they find that the second bomb has done something worse. Its arm and safe switch, unlike the first bomb, is not in the safe position. The impact has rotated the indicator to armed. The arming sequence on the second bomb is further along than the first. Parker F. Jones, supervisor of the Nuclear Weapons Safety Department at Sandia National Laboratories, writes his analysis. The document is headed, "How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb." He writes that the bomb did not possess adequate safety for the airborne alert role. He writes that the safety mechanisms were not complex enough. He writes that what prevented detonation was one switch, one safety switch, and a fair amount of good luck, because that safety switch was later found, in some cases, to be unreliable. A 3.8 megaton detonation over Wayne County, North Carolina, in January 1961 would have produced a fireball. measuring roughly 1.5 kilometers across. Third-degree burns would have extended to a radius of approximately 20 kilometers. Structures within a 5-mile radius would have been destroyed. The fallout pattern, depending on wind direction, would have reached north toward Virginia or east toward the coast. Goldsboro itself, 12 miles from the impact site, would have been within the zone of extreme overpressure. The Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, which housed the aircraft that had just crashed, was also within that radius. There would have been no warning. It was 12:35 in the morning. The people in their beds would not have seen it coming. And none of this is speculation. It is the calculation of the nuclear weapons engineers, who arrived at the scene within hours and spent the following days excavating the crater and accounting for every component of both weapons. One switch, Bob Purifoy, former director of weapon development at Sandia National Laboratories, put it plainly in an interview for the PBS documentary Command and Control. He said bombs are relatively dumb. They sort of think that if you drop the bomb out of the bomb bay, you must have intended to do that. The Air Force issued a public statement on January 24, 1961. It said 2 unarmed devices had been accidentally released over North Carolina and had not exploded. It said there was no danger. That statement was not accurate. Internal documents classified at the time told a different story. Both weapons had begun their arming sequences. One had come within a single switch of detonating. The full picture was not available to the public until Eric Schlosser, the author of Command and Control, filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 2013. The declassified Sandia National Laboratories report that confirmed the details was published that year. 52 years, the people of Goldsboro had been sleeping 12 miles from one of the closest calls in American nuclear history. For 52 years, before anyone told them exactly what had happened above their town. In the middle of the night in January 1961, the historical road marker in the town of Eureka, 3 miles north of the crash site, was erected by the state of North Carolina in July 2012. It reads simply, "Nuclear mishap." The uranium components of the second bomb were never fully recovered from the mud. They remain in the ground in Wayne County to this day. The federal government purchased an easement on the land to prevent digging in the vicinity. The earth near Faro, North Carolina, still contains part of a hydrogen bomb. Here is the detail that matters most. A safety modification to the Mark 39 bomb, known as Alternate 197, had been approved in January 1960. 1 year before the Goldsboro crash. The modification would have prevented the charging of the low-voltage thermal battery when the arm and safe switch was in the safe position. It would have made it impossible for any electrical current to flow through the weapon's arming system, even under the conditions that caused the Goldsboro accident, but it had not yet been applied to all deployed weapons. When Keep 19 took off from Seymour Johnson, it had not been applied to the weapons aboard that aircraft. Therefore, the modification that would have made the Goldsboro bomb safe existed on paper and in approved form 1 year before the crash. But it existed on the weapons as hardware only after the accident had already happened. The Air Force had the solution, but the weapons that needed the solution were carrying 2 live hydrogen bombs over North Carolina on a routine mission. The Strategic Air Command policy of maintaining armed bombers in the air at all times was called Chrome Dome. At any given moment during the late 1950s and early 1960s, multiple B-52s were airborne over the United States and the Atlantic, carrying thermonuclear weapons. The logic was deterrence. If Soviet missiles destroyed American air bases in a first strike, airborne bombers would survive and be able to retaliate. The bombers in the air were the guarantee that the United States could always hit back, but the policy produced a specific and unavoidable risk. A technical failure on an airborne alert aircraft did not simply crash a plane. It potentially deposited hydrogen bombs on American farmland. This had happened before Goldsboro. In October 1959, a B-52 and KC-135 collided during refueling over Hardinsburg, Kentucky. Two unarmed nuclear weapons were partially burned in the resulting fire. But the Goldsboro accident was different. The weapons at Goldsboro were not unarmed. They had gone through their arming sequences. And after Goldsboro, President John F. Kennedy ordered a reduction in Strategic Air Command alert activity. The number and intensity of airborne alert missions were slowed. Therefore, the crash of Keep 19 directly changed. American Nuclear Operations Policy. The bombers did not stop flying entirely, but the frequency was reduced. The risk profile was lowered, because the alternative, as Goldsboro had demonstrated, was not theoretical. It was a hydrogen bomb arming itself above a North Carolina tobacco farm. Explosive ordnance disposal teams from Seymour Johnson and other bases arrived at the crash site within hours of the accident. The first bomb hanging in the tree was disarmed and recovered. The team that reached it found the parachute intact, the casing undamaged, and the arm and safe switch in the safe position. They worked carefully. They knew what they were dealing with. They knew what the weapon was capable of. The second bomb required 8 days of excavation, working in the mud of a Wayne County tobacco field at winter, digging by hand and by machine in rotation. The team recovered 92 detonators, the conventional explosive lenses of the primary stage, and the uranium core. But the secondary stage, which contains the fusion fuel, was not recovered. The engineers calculated that it had gone deeper into the water table. Digging further risked destabilizing what had already been disturbed. The decision was made to stop, to secure the site, to purchase the land rights from the farmer who owned it. The secondary stage of a 3.8 megaton hydrogen bomb is somewhere below the farmland of Wayne County, North Carolina. It has been there since 1:30 in the morning on January 24th, 1961. The Goldsboro accident was one of the primary catalysts for the development and universal deployment of permissive action links, known as PALs. A permissive action link is an electronic lock on a nuclear weapon that requires a valid authorization code before the weapon can be armed. Without the code, the weapon is inert regardless of what mechanical forces act on it. President Kennedy ordered their installation after Goldsboro, specifically because the accident had demonstrated that a mechanical failure in an aircraft could initiate the arming sequence of a nuclear weapon, independent of any human intention. The centrifugal force of a spinning fuselage could pull a lanyard. The impact of a crash could rotate an arming switch. The weapon did not know the difference between an accident and an order. Therefore, a layer of protection that required human authorization rather than simply mechanical safety devices became standard equipment on American nuclear weapons. The Permissive Action Link program transformed the safety architecture of the American nuclear arsenal. It made unauthorized detonation orders of magnitude more difficult. Every nuclear weapon the United States deploys today has a permissive action link. It is a direct legacy of the night a B-52 broke apart over Wayne County, and a hydrogen bomb went through its arming sequence 180 feet below a tobacco field. In meetings following the Goldsboro accident, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara described to congressional and cabinet audiences what the accident had revealed about American nuclear safety. The declassified meeting notes record him saying that by the slightest margin of chance, literally the failure of 2 wires to cross, a nuclear explosion was averted. He concluded that despite their best efforts, the possibility of an accidental nuclear explosion still existed. McNamara was one of the most technically sophisticated defense secretaries the United States ever had. He had been president of Ford Motor Company. He understood systems. He understood failure modes. And what he was telling the people in those meetings was that the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal had come within a single switch of detonating accidentally above an American farming community. But the public was told there was no danger. Therefore, the people of Goldsboro went about their lives. They drove their trucks through faro. They planted their tobacco. They did not know that the uranium component of a hydrogen bomb was somewhere beneath their feet. They did not know for 52 years. The Goldsboro accident produced specific and lasting changes in American nuclear weapons policy and technology. The permissive action links, the reduction of airborne alert missions, the universal application of safety modifications that had been approved but not yet installed, the development of stronger criteria for what constitutes adequate nuclear weapon safety in operational conditions. These changes protected the American public in ways that are impossible to fully quantify, because they worked by preventing things that did not happen. There was no second Goldsboro. There was no detonation over a populated area, not because such accidents became impossible, but because the systems that prevented them were strengthened by the near miss that came closest. Parker F. Jones titled his analysis, "How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb." It is not a title that suggests confidence. It is a title that suggests a scientist who looked clearly at what had almost happened and drew the honest conclusion. The switch held at Goldsboro, but 60 accidents involving nuclear weapons had occurred since World War II. By the time McNamara was briefing cabinet members in 1961, not all of them were as close as Goldsboro. Not all of them are fully known. The secondary stage of the second Goldsboro bomb is still in the ground in Wayne County, North Carolina. The federal government maintains an easement on the site. No digging is permitted. One switch. That is what this story cost. One switch that held. And the switches that came after it, the permissive action links now on every American nuclear weapon, and are what Goldsboro built. Not from ambition, not from planning, from the honest accounting of what almost happened above a tobacco farm at 12:35 in the morning on the 24th of January, 1961. 8 men flew Keep 19 that night. Major Walter Tulloch was the aircraft commander. He had ordered his crew to eject when the B-52 went out of control. 5 of them got out safely. Technical Sergeant Francis Barnish and another crew member did not survive. The men who ejected landed in the darkness of a January morning in Wayne County. They landed in trees and fields and swamps. They gathered themselves and found each other in the dark. Some of them had no idea, when they landed, that the bombs had left the aircraft. Some of them did not know, when they were collected by search teams at dawn, how close the second weapon had come to detonating. They were professional airmen doing a professional job that required them to fly armed nuclear weapons over their own country at all hours of the night. They did not make the policy that put them in the air. They executed it. They did it because it was their mission, and because someone had decided the deterrence value was worth the operational risk. The crew of Keep 19 were not responsible for what happened to their aircraft. A fuel leak caused the failure. A design limitation in the right wing caused the leak to become catastrophic. A policy decision caused hydrogen bombs to be aboard. When the aircraft broke apart, the crew performed exactly as trained. They ejected when ordered. The ones who survived landed and reported to their base. Their names are in the accident report. The accident report is at the National Archives. It has been there since 1961. The excavation team worked for 8 days. They dug by hand first, then by machine. Careful, deliberate, methodical. The mud of Wayne County in January is cold and thick. They recovered most of the weapon. 92 detonators, the conventional explosive lenses, the uranium core of the primary stage. But the secondary stage, the component that contains the thermonuclear fuel, the component that, when triggered by the primary, produces the 3.8 megaton yield, went down into the water table. The team assessed the risk of continuing. They concluded that digging further in the unstable, saturated, already disturbed Earth was not safe. Therefore, the decision was made to stop. The United States government purchased the mineral rights to the affected land from the farmer who owned it. It maintains an easement to this day, prohibiting any excavation in the vicinity of the impact point. A small government-owned plot in Wayne County, North Carolina, unremarkable from the road, is the location where the United States government has permanently secured the right to prevent anyone from digging, because beneath that ground is part of a hydrogen bomb, not a dangerous part by current assessment. The secondary stage without the primary cannot detonate. Without the triggering mechanism, it is inert, but it is there, 300 miles from Washington, 12 miles from Goldsboro, 180 feet below a field that has been farmed and left alone and farmed again for more than 60 years since the night it received its uninvited cargo. The Goldsboro accident is not a footnote in American history. It is one of the most consequential near misses in the history of nuclear weapons, and the changes it produced are still protecting people today. The permissive action links on every American nuclear weapon trace their origin directly to the Kennedy administration's response to what happened over Wayne County. The reduced frequency of airborne alert missions reduced the number of hours that armed nuclear weapons spent over populated American territory. The universal application of the alternate 197 safety modification, delayed for a year before Goldsboro and applied immediately after, closed a vulnerability that had existed in every deployed Mark 39 bomb. The Broken Arrow program, the military's term for nuclear weapons accidents, was intensified and systematized in the wake of Goldsboro. Reporting requirements were strengthened. Investigation protocols were improved. The gap between what the public was told and what had actually happened was, in subsequent decades, narrowed by the work of researchers who used Freedom of Information Act requests to pull the classified records. Eric Schlosser's 2013 book, Command and Control, which finally made the details of the Goldsboro accident widely known, was the product of years of archival research into the classified history of American nuclear weapons accidents. The book documented not only Goldsboro, but the full pattern of accidents that McNamara had described in those meetings. More than 60 accidents, multiple instances where the gap between accident and detonation was measured in single switches or centimeters or seconds. The public that Schlosser reached with that book was the same public that had been sleeping under the flight paths of Chrome Dome bombers for 2 decades without knowing it. They deserved to know. They finally did. That is what accountability looks like when it arrives slowly and incompletely, but still arrives. One switch held on the night of January 24th, 1961. What was built from that night is still holding. To understand why armed nuclear weapons were routinely flying over American cities and farms, you have to understand the specific logic of mutual assured destruction. As it was practiced in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those missiles could reach American air bases in under 30 minutes. If the Soviets launched a first strike against American air bases, and if all American bombers were on the ground, the United States would lose its ability to retaliate. The deterrence would fail. Therefore, Strategic Air Command made the calculation. that some bombers must always be in the air, always armed, always ready, because a bomber in the air could not be destroyed by a missile hitting its base. The bombers were the insurance policy, but the insurance policy required that live hydrogen bombs spend thousands of hours every year, circling at altitude over American territory. The fuel leaks and mechanical failures in mid-air collisions that are statistically inevitable in any large fleet of complex aircraft became, under Chrome Dome, something more than accident reports. They became potential nuclear detonations over American cities. This was not a secret design flaw. It was a known and accepted operational risk. The people who designed and ran Chrome Dome knew that accidents would happen. They calculated that the deterrence value outweighed the accident risk. They may have been right in strategic terms. The deterrence held. The Soviet Union never launched a first strike. But the people sleeping in Goldsboro, North Carolina, had not been consulted about the calculation. They had not been told that armed hydrogen bombs were part of the operational landscape above their homes. They found out in 2013, 52 years after one of those bombs came within one switch of making their consultation moot. Route 111 in Wayne County, North Carolina. At the junction with Faro Road in the town of Eureka, there is a historical road marker. It was erected by the state of North Carolina in July 2012. The marker reads, "Nuclear Mishap." Beneath those two words is a brief description. B-52 transporting 2 nuclear bombs crashed, January 1961. Widespread disaster averted. 3 crewmen died 3 miles south. That is the full official acknowledgement, not a museum, not a memorial, not a detailed account of the arming sequences and the safety switches, and the uranium still in the ground 3 miles away. 2 words, nuclear mishap. The marker is beside a 2-lane road in Wayne County. Most people who drive past it do not know what it is marking. Most people in North Carolina do not know this happened. The people who live near the crash site know more than most. Some of them grew up hearing about it. Some of them have stood at the edge of the field that the government bought the mineral rights to and thought about what is underneath it. The switch held. The marker says mishap. The uranium stays in the ground, and every American nuclear weapon deployed today has a lock on it that requires a code to arm. A code, not a lanyard, not a centrifugal force, not an arming switch that a crash can rotate to armed. A code, that is what Goldsboro built. 1 switch, 1 night, 1 code on every weapon that followed. Parker F. Jones titled his report, "How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb." He was the supervisor of the Nuclear Weapons Safety Department at Sandia National Laboratories. He had spent his career making nuclear weapons safer. He believed in the work. He believed in the program. But after Goldsboro, he sat down and wrote an analysis that said plainly what the accident had revealed. The weapon did not possess adequate safety for the airborne alert role. The safety mechanisms were not complex enough. What prevented detonation was 1 switch and a fair amount of good luck. He did not write this to condemn anyone. He wrote it because it was true, and because the only way to make the next weapon safer was to be honest about why the previous one had not been safe enough. That is what the best engineers do. They look at what failed. They describe it accurately. They fix it. The fix was the permissive action link. The fix was the universal application of alternate 197. The fix was the reduction of airborne alert missions. The fix worked. There was no second Goldsboro. Not because the risk went to 0, but because the people who understood the risk did what Jones did. They wrote it down honestly. They fixed what they could, and they built the next layer of protection from the honest accounting of what had almost gone wrong. One switch held on January 24th, 1961. The people of Goldsboro slept through it. The engineers stayed up, and what they built from that night is still on every nuclear weapon the United States deploys today. That is not nothing. That is exactly what accountability looks like when it works.